I still have my Seinfeld background on.
I was going to say,
ask
Rory,
if you got a new house.
so spacious.
Yeah. It's from a meeting earlier where we were playing with backgrounds, but I guess I'm in Seinfeld's apartment today. How's everyone doing?
It's hot here. Hot. Probably not like it is where you are, though.
You know, it's not too bad today.
Austin's pretty nice today.
All right, people are still joining us, so we'll give people a couple more minutes. Hi, Anne.
Hello.
How are you today?
I'm sorry to say, for those of you that are in extreme heat waves, it's so nice and cool here. It's been cloudy and lovely.
All right, we'll give people a couple more minutes to join us. Does anyone have a good icebreaker we can use for today while we're waiting for more folks? No icebreakers.
Sorry, I thought I did.
Sarah, got an icebreaker?
No, but I'm happy to see Esteban's face. Oh, that does not sound good.
You sound like a robot.
Yeah. Anyway, that's what you sound like.
All right, we'll give people a couple more minutes to join.
I was going to say, it's probably not a coincidence that the Northwest had like their hottest week ever in the history of the entire world, and Esteban moved there from California. So just saying, maybe those things are connected. And you can't talk back because your sound doesn't work. Okay, well now it's 71. How hot did it get in Seattle? I know Portland was like 116 or something. I don't know what that is in Celsius, Kathy. 110, that's crazy for Seattle.
All right, my icebreaker question, since no one else had one, is if you could be any animal, what kind of animal would you be? Erica says sloth. I'd like to be a skunk. Because they have good outfits and people stay away from them. Penguin, cat, otter, 2 otters. Nice, nice, nice. All right. Well, I imagine more people will probably hop on as we get moving, but today we have Ann Dunn with us. Hi, Ann. Do you want to introduce yourself briefly for folks that don't know you?
Sure. I am currently the director of Oakland Animal Services. I've been director now for about a year and a half. Prior to coming to OAS, I founded and ran Cat Town, which is a cat rescue organization that was founded to support Oakland Animal Services, to support cats that were at highest risk for euthanasia. And prior to getting into animal welfare, I worked in public housing for about 20 years.
Thanks so much. And Oakland is one of the tier 1 organizations in this project. And today, Ann is going to talk to us about some of the racial equity work that is happening in Oakland. So without further ado, Ann, take it away.
All right, I'm going to share my screen. And sorry, I'm not seeing my presentation.
That's okay.
It's gonna give me, let's see. I actually have a new computer and this is going to take me a second to figure this out. I apologize.
That's all right. While you're doing that, are there any other organizations that have any kind of equity that's coming through their city or county on the call? And if you do, feel free to speak up while Ann's getting her presentation up, or put in the chat. So any county or city driven initiatives for racial equity.
Right, it's Kathy from Canada. We had a diversity, equity, and inclusion office created corporately. They haven't managed to trickle much down to animal services as yet, but it was interesting given that the population in Brampton is more than 50% non-white. So it's a long time coming for sure.
Awesome. And Chris, you said several committees and commissions. Do those live within a specific department, or?
Yeah, I could probably find some things that I can share. I tend to get them a bit confused. I just got an email because I was on the police department's equity team, which is associated with the city's racial equity commission, but I'm changing departments effective tomorrow, so I don't know if I'm going to be involved anymore. But there's like a county city collaboration on racial equity. We also have a racial equity officer for the city that sits on multiple committees. There's an equity tool in our annual budget. There's a variety of things. I could probably dig up some resources to share.
Thanks for sharing. We can't hear you. If you want to put it in the chat. And were you able to get your presentation, or are you still looking?
I cannot figure out why I can't do it because I see it on my screen, but when I go to share screen, oh, there it is.
Thank you.
Sorry.
No worries.
Okay. Hopefully that was worth the wait. So what I'm sharing today, I just want to clarify, I'm speaking not as a trainer or expert, really as a student. And so what I'm sharing is what kind of structure and support I'm getting through the City of Oakland's Department of Race and Equity. And a lot of this is from that department's training. So we're just really very much at the beginning of this So starting from some of what we're getting from them. So I'm sure you've seen this quote from our former president: "The arc of the moral universe may bend toward justice, but it does not bend on its own." So obviously the work to be done is real, and that, you know, it's not about just waiting and time. It's about doing really strategic work to make changes. So what I'm going to talk about is that kind of support that we're getting to do that. So the city of Oakland has what was, I believe, the first Department of Race and Equity in the country. So this is from our municipal code. The city of Oakland will intentionally integrate on a citywide basis the principle of fair and just in all the city does in order to achieve equitable opportunities for all people and communities. So when I was going through the hiring process a year and a half ago, I was really excited to learn that not only would we be supported in doing racial equity work, but that we're really absolutely required to do it. And a lot of the assessment of my performance is based on how well we're moving forward these principles in animal services. So what I think is really an important starting point is just understanding the difference between equality and equity. And, you know, I think that there was not too long ago, kind of the gold standard was equality, that we're really trying to get to is everybody having the same thing. And, you know, obviously equity is about meeting the needs of people, and that our needs are all not the same. And so if we compare the two slides, and again, this is from the training from the Department of Race and Equity, that these three individuals don't have the same circumstances, don't have the same starting point. So if we look at the, you know, this is not a level playing field, nor are their situations the same. And so you know, if we look at the person on the far left, if the goal is for everybody to have the same positive outcome, which is being able to, in this case, just watch the game, this person is starting from a much higher, better place. And the obstacles before them are much lower compared to the person on the far right. So giving everybody the same thing doesn't get everybody to that same positive outcome. And of course, where that's relevant is, given our extremely limited resources, is making sure that we're directing our resources to people who need it most, and that the outcomes are something that is fair and just. So again, the fair and just across the board, and really trying to focus on a situation where we're removing barriers, we're addressing systemic racism. And what I think is so important here is moving beyond being just gatekeepers to being change agents. And so, and thinking about the gatekeepers and how likely it is that a lot of people are gatekeepers unintentionally. And so I think that the real work then is looking at all of our policies and procedures, looking at the municipal code as it relates to animal services, and just seeing where is it cooked into the systems that maybe we're not even realizing that we're creating obstacles to helping people in our situations in terms of having and keeping their pets. So again, the training that we're receiving, everybody goes through an 8-hour training so that we have an understanding of systemic racism, and, you know, that we're not just looking at, you know, how did we get here today that with all of this disparity in our communities, but why is it that some neighborhoods are in better shape than others? And you know, so just for one example, the history of redlining. And so for us, looking at our own city, and, you know, I'm sure everybody understands that most wealth in this country is accumulated through home ownership. And for a lot of communities, homeownership has been denied. And the history of redlining, that there's no coincidence that, you know, the communities where redlining was in practice and there was systemic disinvestment from certain communities, that those are the same communities today that are really struggling, that still largely lack resources. And if we're looking again at our limited resources, wanting to make sure that we're directing them to these neighborhoods that need them most, and not these neighborhoods that already have their needs largely met. So another way of thinking about this, of course, is, you know, separating the individual from the system. And I think it's, you know, it's a natural thing to do, that we all think of ourselves as individuals. We think about our own merits and what we've accomplished. But thinking about it in the context of what is possible, what are the resources available to us. So separating you know, this is a high opportunity workshop. So of course, if I'm going to go in here, I want to do something and I've got every tool available to me, it's nice and organized. The chances of me succeeding in creating something are pretty high as compared to this workshop. And so you know, again, separating the individual from the system. But if I'm thinking about where am I going to invest my resources, and you know, have the option of the community that has all of their needs met, or the one that has no infrastructure whatsoever, of course, this is where we want to focus our attention. But I think where it becomes really important too is thinking about that, you know, if we're dealing with individuals, we're dealing with individual families, to see it in the context of the system, right? So somebody who doesn't have the resources to provide veterinary care, you know, seeing that not through the eyes of neglect, but seeing that through a lack of resources, and then it's really then our responsibility to provide that support. So in practical terms, what this means for us is, you know, we just went through the 2-year budget cycle, and one of the things that we were required to do in submitting our budget proposal was doing a racial equity analysis and looking at any changes that we wanted to make. We had to do this analysis. So I'll just walk you through one example of something that was in our budget. So I'm going to show you the tool in 3 different slides. So the first is, you know, what is it that we want to do? And in this case, it's deleting a shelter manager position, which I'll be honest was very painful to do, because I would have loved to have kept that position. But it was deleting that position in order to be able to hire another full-time vet. So the question is, what is it that we want to do? What is the impact on the community, and why are we doing it? And so the what is the service impact? Obviously, from the community's perspective, whether or not we have that shelter manager isn't going to make a difference. It's going to make a difference to us internally, but not in the community. But then, what is the difference going to be if we have a full-time vet that can provide community serving programming? So this to me is so key, because we really weren't able through data to support our analysis. So the question is, what data did we review, and then what was the missing and unavailable data? So the missing and unavailable data, I just did an abbreviated list, but I could go on and on. So for us, really all we had to work with was our zip code data, which when I started, we weren't even reliably tracking where animals were coming from. So I'm having to correct that. But then we were very quickly just relying on anecdotal information. So asking the PSRs, our intake specialists, and our animal control officers, you know, what are they hearing from the clients that they're working with as to why animals are coming into the shelter? And the missing data, which to me is so key, is the fact that we were not tracking our interactions with clients. So we track, of course, animals coming into the shelter. We track animals. We track, you know, everything from income to outcome for animals, but we don't track interactions with people. And so one of the things that I've been talking with the city administrator about is, you know, wanting to institutionalize the changes that we're making, and wanting for the city, who, you know, they largely don't think about animal services as being that relevant into what the city is doing. It doesn't seem for most people to fit into anything important. And so one of the things that I've been trying to do in speaking with the city administrator, speaking with council members, is saying, you really should be asking us, what are the outcomes of our interactions with citizens in the community? So if we have somebody calls us on the phone and asks for something, somebody shows up at the shelter because they need to surrender their animal, or we get called out into the field to interact with people. And more often than not, when we get called out by a neighbor who has a concern about their neighbor and their neighbor's treatment of animals. So what I would love to be able to say is what happens in each of those interactions, right? So given the opportunity, or I shouldn't say opportunity, like thinking about the power that we have, that especially the animal control officers have over the people that they interact with, for those interactions, are the outcomes fair and just? Are we doing the right thing? Are we doing the very most good that we could with the resources that we have? Are we missing opportunities to help people? Or in worst case scenario, are we actually doing harm? How do we measure that? And how, again, for the council members or for the city administrator, how does somebody objectively look at what we're doing and how are we using the power that we have? So that to me is just such a big piece of what is missing in terms of how we're tracking what we're doing. So getting back to this very specific instance for our budget, so going back to that, this is the third part of the analysis, is who's impacted by the change that we're making. And in this case, it's a positive change. We believe it's a positive change, which is adding the vet. It's primarily Black and brown people from East and West Oakland. And so East and West Oakland, where I showed you the redlining, those are the communities that we're most focused on providing services, and very specifically providing access to veterinary care for people with limited resources in those communities. So we believe there are no negative impacts to doing that, and so therefore we don't need to do a mitigation plan. But if we were doing the opposite, let's say I was saying, I feel like we need to eliminate the vet position so that I can hire a senior management position, well then we're gonna see very quickly there are negative impacts to the community. I would not be able to justify doing that. So the equity principles in terms of what I'm being tasked to do in the city and how my work is being measured is, again, systems focused on outcome and data driven. I've just said we don't have the data. We don't have, so as we're looking at this, we're really just beginning from scratch. And so much of this is how do we do this in a meaningful way so that we're not just kind of going with our gut and doing what we think is right, but how is there some kind of strategy, but also some way to measure what we're doing. And of course, the goal of this, as I was saying, in terms of the training that we're getting, is staying grounded in history and the root causes of racial inequity, and holding ourselves accountable to the people who are most affected. So this was a part that to me was super helpful in terms of our data and how we measure what we're doing, because the question is, how do we go from how much did we do to how well did we do it, and is anybody better off? And so thinking about how we measure stuff today, if we're sharing our data with our community, what we're sharing is the number of animals we served, how many of them got adopted. Maybe we say how many field services calls we had. But going back to what I was saying earlier, we don't say, is anyone better off, because of what we're doing. And we're really not getting into, especially that human interaction and the interaction that we have with members of the community beyond the animals. And then is anybody better off? So, really having that discipline to measure what it is that we're doing. So I'm just going to give you a couple of examples of how this manifests in the work that we're doing now. And again, the conversations that I have with the city administrator in time, I said when I was hired, I was told, we expect you to have equity be a significant a framework for all of the work that we do. And so as we're making changes, I'm checking in and saying, is this really what you want me to do? Because now I'm representing the city of Oakland and making some pretty drastic changes in the way that the shelter operates. So one piece, and I'm sure you guys deal with this all the time, or if you're an animal services organization or animal control, is barking complaints and nuisance complaints. So we're responsible for the nuisance abatement. And so one of the things that for everyone who deals with this is well aware, is a lot of the times what we're really called into are neighborhood disputes, and really trying to be mindful that we don't get kind of used in that way, just to kind of go after neighbors, but the work that we're doing is appropriate. And so I reached out to the city administrator and the Department of Race and Equity, or the director of Race and Equity, to ask for some guidance around a situation. So we had a situation where we had a bunch of neighbors calling about a family and their dog, and they were saying, you know, the dog is barking incessantly and is being mistreated, isn't being provided adequate care. So our officer went out, and the family said, we're being harassed, that they're a Black family. They had just moved into the neighborhood, a predominantly white neighborhood. And they said as soon as they moved in, they were getting all kinds of, you know, the code compliance coming at them from all different angles. And so they were saying, you're just, you know, you're harassing us, you're being used as a tool for harassment. So we looked at the situation and we're like, it actually did seem that we were being used, but it also, the dog was barking. And so it took a bit for the officer to earn some trust, but the officer was able to work with the family and say, like, your dog really is barking a lot. And the officer worked to, you know, with around enrichment and things like that. And that the dog situation was in really good shape. And so the officer felt really good about the dog was well cared for. Part of what was happening was the dog didn't go inside. And the neighbors thought that that was cruel. And so we see more and more of that, where people have different ideas about, you know, how that dog should be treated. But the point being that I was saying to the city administrator, as I said to the family, like, if you think that we're harassing you, please go to the city administrator, please go to the mayor. Like, we don't want to be doing that, but really trying to figure out, like, how do we deal with these situations? So part of what came out of that is, together we looked at the municipal code, and the municipal code is extremely vague. And you can't have extended annoying noise. And so the race and equity director was saying, like, that's a perfect example of a way that you can harass people because there's no clarity, there's no objectivity. And so, you know, already there's something that we want to fix is the language in the code. The other thing that we talked about is the fact that when we are just, you know, more broadly with the barking complaints, when we get barking complaints, one of the first things that we do is we send a notice, and the notice goes to the property owner. And oftentimes what we're dealing with is a tenant and a property owner. And so I was explaining to the city administrator that whenever we do that, we, you know, the likelihood that we're creating housing insecurity is great, right? So we have a tenant who now has to choose between their dog or their housing. And is that something as a city that we want to be in the middle of, if it's not a situation where it's really extreme? And so one of the things I was instructed to do is, don't do that. Don't send it to the landlord. I mean, send it to the landlord, involve the landlord down the line if it's something really extreme, but to be really careful that we're not harming people unintentionally just by following what has been the practice of the shelter for many years. So last thing is just looking at our mission statement. So bringing back to kind of full circle, I'm not going to read the whole mission statement, but, you know, our mission statement when I first started was basically saying it's our job to help animals, to follow the rules. And what I wanted to do in changing it is to make it about the people, one. So the thing that I added that I think was really important is it's our mission to support people in having the companionship of animals in their lives, directing resources to the animals and people who need it most. So wanting to really, in the spirit of equity, wanting to really have that be part of our mission, is that it's our responsibility to really focus on people who need our support, and not, since we can't do everything that we're asked to do, that we're very intentional in where our resources go. So this is just like a very basic starting point for where we are. And I don't know how helpful that is to anybody, but I'm happy to answer any other questions. But I would also just kind of love to hear from others in terms of, you know, how this is getting incorporated in the work that you're doing.
Thank you so much, Anne. That was such a great presentation and overview of what is happening in Oakland. Thoughts from folks?
Hi, Anne.
Hi, Chris.
So I thought it was great, and I think we're doing similar things, maybe not as well, but things like talking about the history, the systems of oppression in our community, making sure that people understand where they're starting from, that not everybody's starting at the same starting line. And so, addressing things like, why are we talking about race in the workplace? Or, we treat everybody the same. So why do we have to sit and listen to a discussion or webinar on this? It's about being intentional. And I think I have an understanding of where we've come from to know how we can do it better. I too have revised our mission like 8 times since I've been here, and it was more wordy like your original one, like 3 times as long as that actually, and now it's much shorter so that people can remember it. But focusing on the human-animal bond, and so I applaud you for the work you're doing and appreciate it. And I'm going to incorporate the redlining map for Rochester in my presentation next week at Cornell Vet Conference because of your inspiration.
Thank you.
Other thoughts from folks? Trying to make space for the Zoom pause. I'm curious what people thought of the difference between equality and equity, and if that's like new for people, or if that feels if that's also sort of like how y'all are thinking about this within your own organizations.
It's Kathy from Canada, and I would say, Rory, that graphic that Anne showed, I think I've seen a few times on various Haas calls, but specific to Haas, definitely. The work that the project is doing to promote DEI and to really call attention to the challenges is to some degree what's opened my eyes to that difference. And so it's quite beneficial. And it certainly doesn't hurt to see it again and again and again, because it's so true. And to Anne's point, we all started out from a position of wanting to ensure equality. Well, really what we want to do and what we should be doing is working towards equity for people.
Thanks, Kathy, for sharing. Anybody else have any thoughts about that?
I'd seen it before, but it was super helpful to get like a little review of it because good.
I know, I love that graphic. And the example that you gave of sort of this like vague ordinance, is it an ordinance or?
Yeah, it's part of the municipal code.
Yeah, the code is so interesting. And I'm wondering if other people have any sort of like thoughts about vague codes or ordinances that exist like in your communities, and just hear those if you want to share in the chat or speak up.
It's Kathy again. So I could completely appreciate what Anne was saying. I mean, we do similar sorts of things, although the barking dog piece falls under our bylaw enforcement team, which is a different division, and the noise bylaw specifically, but they do exactly the same thing. They send notices to the property owner. And so, that when you think back to it, that's who they would be charging as well, if they're not able to bring the dog owner, who's likely a tenant, into compliance. And so to Anne's point, that then risks the whole issue of housing insecurity. And we have similarly vague wording, something to the effect of, negatively impacting the ability of others to enjoy their property. Well, how the heck do you come up with a case that's going to go anywhere in court? But I guess they do. And so, so definitely. But what I really liked about Anne's presentation was the fact she kept coming back to the CAO and saying, are you sure that this is really what you want us doing? Like, this is what's actually happening with what you want us to do. And just continually shining that light on, this is what we're hearing and this is what you're telling us to do, but this is the outcome of that. And you really need to be aware of that.
And I would say that the good thing for us too, and I feel so grateful for this, is he's so clear, and there's such clarity in the city government that, like, yes, absolutely, we're asking you to do the right thing. And the reason I'm doing this proactively is I know it's a change, and people will go to their council members, they'll go to the mayor, they're going to reach out with outrage. And this happens with people off-leash dogs. People are always telling us, there are all these dogs off leash, and we need to be monitoring it. And I'm just really honest. And I did go to the city administrator, and I said, I get these calls frequently, and this is what I'm telling people is we do not have the resources to go monitor dogs off leash who aren't causing any problems. And we have to choose between providing these urgent services or doing what you think is urgent, and you who could just go to a different park if you wanted to. That yes, it's in the municipal code, and yes, I can see why there would be an expectation, but we do have to pick and choose what we can do, and that's not important. If there's a dog that is vicious, that is off leash, if there's some public safety issue, absolutely, it's an urgent situation and we'll respond. So again, I go to the city administrator because I know these calls are going to come to him next, and just make sure that he agrees, and he always does. So I feel extremely grateful for that.
Just giving some awkward Zoom pause there and to jump in. So the data that you mentioned collecting, so interesting. So can you just say again how those points came about, and just like how often you're collecting them for me if I missed it, and anybody else who's interested?
Oh, we never collected. That was my point, is we don't have any data.
Gotcha.
And so what I've been trying to do, I mean, I don't know so I'll just say again, what I would like to have happen is I would like that we have a record of every time somebody reaches out for service, or we get called out into the field, and what is the circumstance. What was the decision of the OAS staff member? What did they do? Did they do something good? Did they do something bad? Did they do something neutral? Did they miss an opportunity? And again, going back to, is it just and fair, and is it equitable? Are we really looking at this from a perspective of solving problems that are about, and the obvious examples of, before I started, and is, we would just go and seize animals. An animal was in poor care, we would seize the animal. And then we would put that person's name in our database to make sure they never got another animal. Job done, right? So, if you, a couple of years ago, that would look like success. That would look like we were doing a good job. And today it looks like failure. So my larger point, though, is wanting the council members and the city administrator to really buy into that, that it is absolutely our responsibility. So please don't let somebody follow me who doesn't feel responsible to that. And how do we cook this in and institutionalize this so there is no going back? Because I think that we've just operated in the shadows as an agency. You know, that's my other point of like, nobody thinks that we're that important. And so, but the impact that we have on people's lives is significant. And so for people who have been on the other side of our services and felt that those services were unjust, they know the power that we have. And so how are we held accountable? That's what I'm really getting at.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. So what do people feel like they can take away from this and take back to your own organizations? Such a quiet group today. Nothing. So quiet. Caitlin, since you put,
I was going to say, if I speak up again, I'm going to have to change my name from Kathy from Canada to Chatty Kathy, and I'm not doing that. But I feel like there were a couple of great points, especially in some of the last comments that Anne made. And you know, when you talk about people phoning all the time, let's say for dogs off leash, it's so interesting because I recently had an interview for another organization, and I needed to do, for the interview, I had to do a presentation related to, you know, the ongoing and ever increasing, quote unquote, problem of dogs off leash in that area. And so I went into their, you know, city database and I pulled a bunch of numbers. And in the presentation, I said, like, let's really look at the numbers and see what the scope of the problem is. So if we use reasonable formulas that are available to estimate the number of dogs owned in this city, we would come up with approximately 580,000. Now you've got, you know, 55,000 of those actually licensed, so good on you. But when you look at the stats for that same year with that potential population of dogs, it looks like 0.01% of the dogs in the city might actually be running at large in a given year. So is that really a problem? You know, like let's put things into perspective. How many people are there in the area, and how many dogs are you picking up or getting complaints about running at large? And I think sometimes having the ability to do that for those senior administrators or even for the residents really puts things in perspective. And I was listening this morning to one of the recordings from the Best Friend Conference from last week. And, you know, one of the speakers in the welcome session talked about the fact that they took a similar situation that they were experiencing in animal services to what was happening with their paramedics in their location. And that was, it was, I think that the wording was, if you call, we'll haul. So the paramedics would get a call for a splinter or heart attack, and they would rush out and attend, and they were finding that they didn't have ambulances available to deal with the really important things. So good on Anne for saying, you know, I'm upfront and telling people, essentially, your expectations are somewhat unrealistic. We can't answer all of these calls the way that you think we should. We're going to answer the ones that are the most important. So we're going to go to the heart attacks first, because that's where we need to be. And then we need to say, you know, is it really, what is the real problem? Is this a symptom, the dog's running at large, or is that really the problem? And start to drill down. And I loved her comment about, you know, yeah, animal services, in my experience as well, is always kind of low on the totem pole in a municipal government. We only get the attention of council and senior management when people start complaining that we're bad. But you know, those people who we interact with every day and who we do those things to, that we've all done, I think, and in the past, you know, yeah, they know what it's like to interact with animal services, and it's not a good thing. I mean, I don't know how many times I've had people phone crying about the dog that we picked up and we're going to take it away and euthanize it. And I'm like, no, that's not what we're doing. But that's what they think. So.
Oh, Caitlin had a really good question. Have you found any specific messages or methods to help staff members or supporters understand how important equity is when they are resistant to this message?
Well, I guess it's a question of why are they resistant? So I feel like I live in a bubble. So, you know, in Oakland, I mean, the staff members, I can't think of a single person that isn't thrilled that we're doing what we're doing. You know, and I always think about the animal control officers who, you know, are the front lines that I would have thought would be the most resistant to change, who were just so relieved to be able to help. And so I think, you know, I focus on that, you know, and even like thinking about that what Kathy was just talking about. And, you know, I often talk about the analogy to the medical care system of, you know, realizing at some point that the over-reliance on emergency rooms and the need for preventive care and community clinics, that, you know, if you think about how ineffective it is to take people's animals from them. So we have an animal that needs veterinary care. So we take the dog from the person who can't afford the care, who loves the dog and wants that dog to stay there. And then we provide the care anyway. And then we house the animal and we clean our shelter and we hold on to the animal, and then we have staff that have to then go find that animal another home. What are we doing? Why didn't we just provide that service to keep the animal where they were? So even if it's not from a point of compassion, if you think of it from a point of efficiency, and then, you know, we're not in a situation where we have any shortage of animals. So, you know, to have to go and find all these homes. And I think that the other thing that people just don't understand, for a lot of, like, going back to that situation with the dog that lived in the backyard, you know, a lot of the animals that were being seized were ultimately not adoptable. I mean, so they're in homes where they were loved and they were thriving there, or thriving. I mean, there would have been a reason to take them. So I don't want to romanticize that. But that, you know, to transition that animal into, you know, this idyllic idea of like every dog must go to a dog park and, you know, all of that kind of stuff. It's just, you know, I don't know. I could just go on and on. Just having a different set of a different perception is the beginning, I guess. So I don't know if that in any way addresses the question.
So I'm curious. I have a question, and curious because I think that oftentimes we're talking about sort of idea that relates to like services that we offer, but I'm wondering if if you're doing any work with this lens around like who's volunteering, who's fostering, and like who is working within your organization.
Yeah, I don't know how this sounded to the volunteers, but you know, so I was saying I started about 1.5 years ago, and on my first day I had a meeting with all of the volunteers, and I said, you know, the way that I see Oakland Animal Services, and I see the whole the whole industry is the intersection of white privilege and systemic racism. And, you know, we have all of our volunteers. I mean, I would say 99.9% of our volunteers are very privileged white people that have time to come walk dogs, and you know, we're grateful for them. But the challenge, and I think this probably goes to that earlier question, is, you know, to have people who are volunteering and feeling like we're adopting to people who aren't good enough, you know, things like that. So one of the things that we're talking a lot about, we had an opportunity, is, you know, everybody had lots of opportunity during COVID to really kind of rethink how we do things. And so we're doing, for our adoption programs, really looking at how do we make our adoptions as accessible as possible for people who are, you know, we just really started talking about this, right? So we have the most of the animals that leave the shelter historically leave through transfer partners. And so when we started really looking at that, we were grateful for our transfer partners, and we need our transfer partners. But what we're finding is, animals that are the easiest, that are the most appropriate for first time, for families with young kids, having those animals go to transfer partners means that, one, all of a sudden it's a lot harder to get approved to adopt that animal. In most cases, there's all kinds of restrictions that we would not apply. And the adoption fee, is sometimes like as much as 4 times greater, right? So we're asking ourselves, what are we doing? We've just made it almost impossible for most people in our community to adopt if we're transferring a lot of and these are local partners. So one thing that we're really trying to do is focus on our community. And so when we're looking at adoption applications, we're looking, where do people live? And are they from Oakland? Are they people that would otherwise not have access? And are they people that have been turned down? Like maybe they live in apartments, and people, all that, how rigid so many adoption programs are. So that's one area that we're looking at. And then as we have this great opportunity too, because we did have a lot of attrition during COVID through our volunteer program. So we're saying to our volunteers now, for those who are wanting to continue with us, that we've restructured pretty significantly. And so now we're really looking for, we have these different programs around accessible adoptions, things like that. And so our next phase is recruitment, and how do we really kind of grow that volunteer program in the direction. So we're not forcing people to change who feel uncomfortable about the changes that we're making. We're finding the people that are excited about the work that we're doing.
So interesting. Thank you. There's a couple of questions in the chat from Chris. Chris, do you want to ask them?
So just thinking about accessibility, do you do free adoptions? And if so, do you limit it to Oakland residents, or is it open to anybody?
We do free adoptions, and when we have done them, we've had it for anybody. But that's a really interesting question, because we really just started having this conversation in the last couple of months of how do we really zero in on Oakland residents and seek them out, one, and make it super easy. So that's a really nice idea, to have it be specific to Oakland residents. I didn't think about.
Well, we just came up with it together because you were speaking and I was writing it down. So yeah, so we'll both try it and let each other know how it works.
Yeah, I love that.
The other question was just, so I talked to my animal control officers last week. We're referring to them as animal services officers, effective like today. So nice. Breaking news. I got some pushback on certain things I was saying about supportive services, and it was basically coming back to there's a complainant on every one of these calls. We're not just out there, looking for problems. So if you have a complainant that's upset about the barking or about the loose dogs or whatever, are you using the same sort of explanation that you gave earlier about we just have limited resources and this is like the best use of our limited resources? Or how are you addressing the concerns from the complainants that don't care that we're supporting keeping animals with families?
Yeah, I mean, we are being is kind of universal in our messaging as we can be, so we have, I'm saying I started a year and a half ago, and our assistant director started around the same time. And so he's been the one who's been working the most closely with our animal control officers, and they actually love that animal control piece. So I don't think I could wrest that away from them, unfortunately. But is explaining our constraints and explaining our vision, right? That this is something we're proud of. And so if people don't agree that this is the right thing to do, it's kind of like, okay, well, this is what we're doing. And so, but I think that this is really where it goes back to the municipal code. And we are spending a lot of time just going line by line in the municipal code is, are there obligations there that we're not upholding that are in the code, but we wish weren't. And so that's really what we're trying to change. And there is so much outdated language around how we should be behaving. But I think that the thing, so for our particular officers, I always say, I feel like the reason that they're so amenable to the changes is they feel far more aligned with people living on the streets than they do people living in the hills. And so it takes very little for them. I mean, if there's bias against people who are entitled, right? So I feel like in some ways I have to kind of like fight that fight too, of like, we need to be fair and we need to treat everybody with respect, and we shouldn't be making any assessments, judgments about anybody, but helping people understand like that's not really our place, nor is it possible, right? Like, we're not going to stop dogs from barking, you know, to try to help people just be a little more reasonable about their expectations.
Thank you
One
so
of the
much.
things that I've done in the past, Chris, is whether it's counselors who are trying to add yet another offense for, you know, the one-offs, or whether it's residents, I've said, you know, this is the reality of the process. It's a bylaw. So for us, that means we're not going to be able to remove the animal from the situation. Our solution is lay a charge under the bylaw that then goes to court, where it may or may not make it through the court process at all, given the prosecutors and the lack of court time, et cetera. And if it does make it through the court process, there may or may not be a conviction registered. And if there is a conviction registered, you know, then what's the reality of the fine? Because that's the only outcome we have available to us in that venue, is a fine against the person. Well, you know, our justices of the peace are dealing with fatalities under the Highway Traffic Act. You know, the dog running at large, unless there's a major issue, even if they're a repeat offender, and that's the only ones we would even take to court, they're going to go, well, this is the first time they've been to court. In the greater scheme of things, we're either going to give them a suspended sentence, which means no fine, or we might charge them $25. So now I've just spent all this money of our time, our prosecutor's time, the court's time, to do nothing with respect to resolving the situation. So I work through that with the residents and say, look, you know, it's much more effective for us to work with people to try to come to resolution than to go through that process. And I appreciate you want me to throw the book at them, but the book you want me to throw at them isn't going to do what you think it's going to do.
Any last minute comments from you, Anne?
I can't think of anything else. I appreciate everyone being here, and it was a good conversation. And I hope, you know, I think we're all hopefully invested in moving this forward. And so thank you for being here.
Agree. I can't wait to hear updates from you also just about everything that you're doing. Thank you so much for being here today and for answering all of our questions and sharing with us. Super helpful to see just where this conversation can go when there is investment from the city level. So really appreciate it. And next week, we will have Dr. Sheila Sagerson here with us talking about behavior medication in the shelter. So invite your behavior folks if you're concerned, interested, confused about behavior medication. Dr. Sheila Sagerson is a veterinary behaviorist and the director of research for Maddie's Fund. So, and one of my favorite people. So, please come, bring some folks, and thank you so much, Anne. It's always such a pleasure to see you and hear about the amazing work that you're leading.
Thank you.
All right, everybody. Thanks so much. Talk
Bye.
soon.